Hey there, sixth grade. Why did the fish stop lifting weights? Because he pulled a muscle. Ha. Uh, why did the hamburger go to the gym? To get better buns. Uh, oh my goodness. Actually, I shouldn't really be making weightlifting jokes today because today's my rest day, my day off. I usually don't take a rest day. In fact, I don't always take a rest day, but when I do, it's to give the weights the day off. That one wasn't as good, but that's okay. All right, so we are on John chapter 18, the last of the four Gospels. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are what's called the synoptic Gospels. It's a term you need to know, synoptics. They are similar to each other. There's a lot of overlap between the synoptic Gospels. And they were written basically in a similar time period. Some people think Mark was written first, although I lean towards the idea that it's probably Matthew's Gospel that was written first, and then Mark's. John's Gospel, however, is separate, and we know it was written later. It's called the fourth Gospel. It's not a synoptic gospel. It was written a while after the other three gospels were written. And in fact, John's gospel refers several times to the writings of the other three gospels. Right? In addition to writing John's gospel, John also wrote the book of Revelation, aka the Apocalypse. Fun fact, apocalypse means removing of the veil, by the way. So, just FYI, you can show off your knowledge when you're talking to your parents or something. Be like, Mom, did you know that apocalypse means removing a veil? I know they'll be very impressed. John also wrote 3 letters in the New Testament called 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John. All right, so just like Matthew, the Apostle John was one of the 12. But John seems to have a very special relationship with Jesus. He's described as the disciple who Jesus loved, which means that he's probably Jesus' closest friend. Another thing to know about John is that he was a lot younger than the other apostles. So assuming Jesus started his public ministry when Jesus was 30, John was probably 18 or 19 at that time when he was chosen to be one of the 12. Right, so John was a very young adult. And then by the time Jesus is crucified, John is in his early 20s. So he's a young guy compared to Jesus and the other apostles. John is also the apostle who is at the foot of the cross when Jesus died. Now, in Matthew's gospel, it says none of the men were there, only the women. But in the other Gospels, John is present with Mary at the foot of the cross. And Jesus turns to John and asks John to take care of his mother. Right? He says to John, "Behold your mother." Right? In other words, Mary, he was giving Mary into John's care, and he was also giving the church Mary as its mother. So even from the cross, Christ is teaching. Now, where Mark's gospel is brief and focuses on miracles Jesus performs and just kind of reporting the facts, kind of like a newspaper would. Luke's gospel, we know, focuses on healing because Luke is a physician. Matthew's gospel focuses on Christ's relationship to the Jews and Israel, because Matthew is a Jew and he's intending his gospel for his immediate audience, which was Jewish people. John is different. He emphasizes Christ's divinity. So he focuses a lot on Christ's glory, his divine nature, not his human nature. I mean, John still acknowledges his human nature, but he likes to shine the spotlight on Christ's divine nature. Right? So he wants his readers to increase their faith in the resurrected Christ. So John's gospel It's really heavy on miraculous events and the resurrection. But his passion narrative is still very interesting. Okay, so John leaves the Last Supper out of his passion narrative. John begins his passion narrative in the Garden of Gethsemane, but he doesn't talk about Jesus' suffering and his prayers in the Garden of Gethsemane. The Father, if you let, please let this cup pass, but not my will, your be done. That prayer is not in his Garden of Gethsemane scene. The sweating blood is not in it. The disciples falling asleep is not in it. Instead, John begins his gospel by showing Judas's betrayal. So he starts by saying that Judas leads men to come to arrest Jesus, but Jesus approaches the men, right? So while the men are coming, Jesus walks up to them. And remember, these men are there to arrest Jesus, and it's nighttime, right? So these are probably not like good men. Jesus approaches them, and he announces himself. He says, I am Jesus of Nazareth, right? I am Jesus Christ. I forget the exact words he says, but he announces himself as Jesus. And when he says this, the soldiers, the men who have come to arrest him, fall to the ground, right? Jesus identifying himself causes them to fall down. So right away, we see John emphasizing Christ's divine power, right? His words have the power to knock the soldiers down. And then Jesus commands the soldiers, you can arrest me, but you have to let everyone else go. And the soldiers obey Jesus, right? They willingly obey Jesus' command. They let the apostles go. So just like in Matthew's gospel, Jesus is in control here, except he's like, his divine nature is showing through in John's gospel, right? Not only is he in control of the scene, but he's actually like controlling what the soldiers are doing in John's gospel. All right, next, Jesus is taken to the house of Annas, who is a powerful religious figure. He's sort of like the retired high priest. So I believe in Matthew's gospel, he's taken to the house of Caiaphas. John's, he's taken to the house of Annas. And unlike the other gospels, John tells us that Jesus actually defends himself in his trial before the Jewish leaders. But Jesus does so in a humble and meek way with very good arguments. Right? Then Peter denies Christ. And for reasons we talked about in previous videos, Jesus is brought to Pontius Pilate. Right? But the Jewish priests and leaders who bring Jesus to Pontius Pilate refuse to go into Pontius Pilate's house. Now, why is this? Well, because Jewish law says that any Jew who enters the house of a Gentile has become defiled. And then they have to go through a cleaning ritual for 7 days before they're allowed to participate in any Jewish religious festivals. Right? So Pilate, as a Roman, is not a Jewish person, right? He is a polytheist. He is a pagan. He believes in the Roman gods and goddesses. He's a Gentile, right? So his house under Jewish law would be unclean. And what time is it in the Jewish year? Well, this is one of the holiest times in the Jewish year. It's the time of the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, the consecrating of the firstborn, and the Passover, right? And the Jewish leaders want to participate in these religious festivals, so they cannot go into Pilate's house. So they have to stay outside. Now, Matthew is showing that they're being hypocrites by doing this because they know Jesus is innocent, right? So they're already breaking the Jewish law because they're lying about an innocent person in order to put them to death, right? This violates several commandments. It's a clear violation of Jewish law. And yet they don't care about violating that part of the Jewish law. They care about the much smaller part of the Jewish law that says you can't go into a Gentile's house without doing a cleansing ritual for 7 days after, right? So this is a little bit like paying attention to not eating meat on Fridays during Lent, which is good, but ignoring much bigger sins like cheating or lying, right? So if you like cheat or lie, those are much bigger sins than not eating meat on Friday. Right? So John's saying, like, what are you doing? If you're committing really serious sins, then not eating meat on Friday is like nothing, right? Or eating meat on Friday, breaking that restriction, that's like nothing compared to bigger sins. Okay. Now, Jesus' trial before Pilate has a lot of details, right? But he doesn't include questions that the high priest asks at the trial before Pilate. So when Jesus is brought before Pilate, the Jews tell Pilate that Jesus is an evildoer, and Pilate doesn't care, right? Pilate's like, okay, so what do you mean by evildoer? Did he break any Roman laws? And the high priests are like, well, he's just a bad guy. And Pilate's like, then you handle it, right? You don't need to bring him to me unless he broke like some serious Roman Empire laws, right? So he tells them to take care of themselves. And then the Jews say, okay, let's be clear. We are bringing Jesus here because we want you to condemn him to crucifixion. Right? And again, the Jews are doing this because they can't put Jesus to death by themselves. They could get away with it if they wanted to, right? They could have Jesus stoned to death, for example. In fact, Jewish leaders often encourage crowds to stone evildoers to death, and the Romans just kind of like looked the other way. But the Jewish leaders were not allowed to perform any crucifixions. This was something explicitly, exclusively reserved to the Roman government. Only the Roman government had this power. Right? The Jews also don't want Jesus to be stoned to death. They specifically want him to be crucified. And the reason they want him to be crucified is because crucifixion makes it likely. Oh, whoops. Got that playing in the back. Well, there you go. Yeah, beast up. Come on. Well, as I was saying, they specifically don't want Jesus to be crucified. I mean, they specifically do want Jesus to be crucified because crucifixion is a punishment that is not going to inspire people to rebel against the punishment. Crucifixion is like a really public form of punishment that says, hey, this is what the Roman government will do to you if you rebel, right? And remember, the Jewish leaders know Jesus is popular. They do not want him to rebel. They do not want that at all. All right. I can't believe I lost my... All right. Let's scroll down and see how far we got. 1, 2... Okay, yeah. They don't want his followers to fight back. So Jesus has been accused now of committing a political crime by calling himself a king, which is illegal because in the Roman Empire you can't say that you're a king. Now, King Herod was a different kind of king, right? He was a king that has the approval of the Roman authority, but no one else can say that they're a king. That's illegal. That's a crime. So Pilate cares about that. He asks Jesus if he's a king, and Jesus doesn't really answer. Instead, he says, my kingship is not of this world, right? Which makes Pilate think, oh, well, he's talking about like some supernatural thing. I don't care if Jesus talks about supernatural stuff. I'm not a Jewish person, right? Then he says, he has come to bear witness to the truth. And then Pilate's like, okay, this guy's like very philosophical. So Pilate says, what is truth? Now, why doesn't Jesus answer Pilate's question about kingship in the way that Pilate wants? Because he wants Pilate and all the witnesses there to know that he is a king. He's just not the kind of king that they think he is. Right? He's not a political king. When he says he's come to bear witness to the truth, he's pointing out that the people who have accused him are liars and that he is a savior who's going to bring truth to them, right? And then finally, Pilate's question, what is truth? This is a question that shows that Pilate doesn't really believe in truth, right? Pilate believes that whatever the